Let me give a quick blurb here on Professor Newfield, and then we'll get to his talk. He's got a PowerPoint that I set up too, so we can. Want to do that while we'll get to that in a second. All right. Again, he's Professor of Literature and American Studies at UCSB. His main current areas of research are innovation theory, hence his presence here, and critical university studies, a field he helped found. His books include the book Mapping Multiculturalism, The Emerson Effect, subtitled Individualism and Submission in America, Ivy and Industry, Business in the Making of the American University, 1880-1980. That's at Duke University Press, 2003. And then Unmaking the Public University, The 40-Year Assault on Middle Class, it's Harvard, 2008. His writing also covers American political psychology, race relations, science studies, future of solar energy. I think it's kind of cool. It's unlike, one of these is like the others, right? But that's a cool topic, actually. Humanities-based approaches to economics, which is very, very well, by the way. He teaches courses on detective fiction, which I love, California Noir, innovation studies, critical theory, future of higher education, English majoring after college, among others. And he blogs on higher education, funding and policy at the blog Remaking the University, which we discussed in our Humanities Center a few weeks back. And also the Huffington Post, Chronicle of Higher Education. And he's currently completing a book called Lowered Education, What to Do About Our Downsized Future. Now, I've got to say, I met Chris at the Conference for the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes last year. And this brings together Humanities Center directors from all over the world. And they choose their guests there pretty carefully. And they chose Chris knowing what they were going to get was a really good assessment on the state of higher education. And Chris gave an outstanding presentation. And right then I knew if we could possibly get him here, it'd be a real coup for us. He's quite a hot property on the speaker circuit. In fact, he's here at all is very gracious. He's in Texas next week. He's bouncing back and forth across multiple states. Not much fun for traveling, but it's great to have him here. His talk is entitled Humanities and Innovation in the 21st Century University. Please welcome with me Christopher Newfield.
Thanks. That's pretty nice. Thanks, Matt. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate that. I'll try not to disprove that last part, especially being a good speaker. Really, what I'm tempted to do is just lead a discussion about Bob's excellent paper. There's all sorts of things I hope we get a chance to talk about afterwards, particularly the inspirational ending, because I completely agree that that's pretty much where we need to go. A couple of things I would just pull out in the beginning. You did a lovely job of showing the university, their higher education as a practice caught in this web of commercial practices that are tied to extremely powerful interests. So it's a daunting challenge to imagine how to pull, for example, teacher assessment out of this Pearson system that you described very briefly. And the other thing that I think is especially important is, among many things actually, is what you said about individual institutions honoring and developing local practices that are distinctive to them and that come out of their own traditions and values and communities. That really does seem to have eroded in this kind of mutual imitation of essentially Harvard. And I think it's pernicious in countries that are developing their own higher education systems to always be looking away. And I went to Singapore this summer and was relieved to see that actually that's not happening so much anymore, that in Asia there's much more interest in local practices, and I'm really pleased to hear that that's been happening here at Brigham Young and that you're part of that process, so thank you. I have some PowerPoints here that are not up there because this is disconnected. Okay, so the technical problem has just been solved. I'm putting these up here as partly as I like to talk better than read out loud. And it's also there to signal that, this is kind of potentially interactive. If you see something up there that you would like me to explain or go into further or skip, et cetera, I'm really happy to do that. Let's see if this jogs it if we do that. All right, so this is quite interruptible. There we go. Okay. Sorry?
I was joking, disruptive innovation.
Yes. This grows out of an interest, as you heard Bob discuss, in saving public universities, which I do think are sort of the foundation of democracy, multiracial democracy in particular, inclusion of kinds that is both ethical. I mean, I don't think we have ethical societies without a certain amount of equality and interactivity, and the possibility of people to feel like they can be creative because of a context in which they are sufficiently equal with the people that they are working with to express themselves candidly and to think imaginatively. And that's become increasingly rare in our political space. So I've been clinging, like a lot of people, to the university as a place where that has remained possible. But something that I began to notice when I was working more with scientists and engineers in the mid-2000s in something that I was a co-founder of called the Center for Nanotechnology and Society, is the extent to which you could attract attention if you seemed innovative, and you would repel attention if you did not. So innovation became a word for kind of distinguishing between the sheep and the goats within a university community. And it was, as I thought about it more, I realized that it's actually connected to a trend in the media and political worlds that I associate with Thomas Friedman at the New York Times, who wrote a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree, which was a massive international bestseller. I believe was published around 97, something like that, which argued essentially that the future is the Lexus and the olive tree around which communities form in relation to their beliefs and local practices is the past. So I think that's completely wrong. I also was clear from the beginning that it discriminates against the humanities and the social sciences because we are fairly easily stigmatized as attached to tradition and older ways rather than as looking towards the future and inventing the future along with everybody else in the society, including scientists and engineers. So that was partly the motivation behind the solar energy material, because it's really a project about innovation theory, but it's also been part of a project that I'm interested in bringing the saints and sinners together, scientists and humanists, and getting humanists, including myself, to think more clearly about what our contribution is to both critiquing innovation discourse as it currently is structured and in showing a way towards something better. In other words, not just criticizing, but also saying, well, here's also my better idea. So that's where this originated for me. It's also motivated by my concern about the millennial generation who is interested in entering so-called creative industries. It's more of a British term. But it's, I as an English professor, at UC Santa Barbara, teach probably 450 students a year. I get to know maybe 10% of those well. And I would say 60 to 80% of the ones that I learn to know well are interested in going into publishing, in education, into Hollywood or new media in some way. They want to provide content. They want to be creative and do creative things. They want to live in and also help expand an imaginative world that is more humane and more interesting than the ones that many of us are born into. And yet they have an extremely difficult time imagining how they're going to be able to support themselves. So a book among many that millennials or sort of late X or Gen Y people have started to write includes a book by a guy named Daniel Brooke called The Trap. And what he does is he follows some people more or less of his generation, he's probably about 30 now, who figured out different strategies of supporting creative activity or socially developmental activity. And the two people that he looked at are Pam and Claire. And Pam worked for Billionaires for Bush, which was a street performance group that showed up at demonstrations all over the United States, all through the George W. Bush presidency. And she also works at the same time as a publicist for a major bank. And then Claire works full-time on an NGO that I think is responsive mostly to sexual trauma and doesn't have another job. And what has essentially happened is that they've produced two different pretty common pathways, neither of which is actually sustainable. One being kind of earning a comfortable living, selling out, and feeling like your personal creative work is just a sidelight that you do when you have time, and the other, the creative or the contributory to a community work that in fact is driving you further and further into debt and poverty, and which you will have to leave at, say, age 29 or 34 when you just can't hang on anymore and you need to actually make a living. So I think it's a fairly common situation, and then it was worsened after this and other similar books came out by the crisis that began in 2008. And so I won't read through these, but I'm just going to put these numbers up. There are basically 100% of the interesting industries that my students, and I'm sure many of yours would like to enter, lost somewhere between 20, 30, 50% of their jobs in the 5 years of the crisis that may or may not be over as we sit here. Some of them involving music, some of them involving architecture. Many of them as being kind of second-tier services that seem practical, that seem to be honoring technical skills, but which in fact are as vulnerable economically and as fragile in terms of offering a settled, stable career which will allow you to settle down in the traditional sense of that, as being a musician or being an actor. So in other words, the really risky jobs are really risky, but then the jobs that seemed like they were going to be more stable and that seemed like a compromise that you could convince your parents would justify them paying for college have turned out to be similarly fragile. One of the ones that I find most traumatic as a huge theater hound and opera lover is that in the possibly 1.5 cities in the United States that is capable of sustaining professional musicians or musicians, classical musicians, as a profession over a lifetime, that takes you 15 years to start to do properly, and then another 30 to become really great at, they lost half their members in the same period. So it's, it's horrible. I don't know if any of you heard this phrase, Planet 22, 22, 22 basically stands for being 22 years old, making $22,000 and working 22 hours a day as, sort of the new norm. And there are lots of examples of unpaid internships or low paid internships where you're expected to work 65 hours a week and where you can be basically fired at will for simply not being slavish enough. So essentially, one of the things that's been happening for the students that wind up in the humanities and the qualitative social sciences is that yesterday's bad jobs turn out to be their good jobs. They're jobs that allow them to be creative, or at least to have the hope that they can step into that position in the near future, the imaginable future, that we've produced new levels of white-collar exploitation in creative industries rather than creative industries being the place where you try to keep that out. So, Bob talked about the adjuncting crisis in academic labor, which is widespread and widely known. When did it become okay for universities, these pillars of enlightenment, to have some of the most exploitative working conditions in the United States rather than the least? And the same can be said of many of these other industries, whether it's a photography studio or even companies that have, good margins, but that are nonetheless, building up cash with cash reserves for rainy days that they imagine are going to happen in the next few weeks because of the instability of their own larger industries. So there's all sorts of problems with this. And then the thing that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more is, and this is connected to what Bob said earlier about globalization, is that we're getting very highly skilled people into low pay positions rather than high pay positions, where the one thing that's remaining from the old thing that you used to think you would get if you got high level skills is high stress. You don't get the high pay, you do get the high stress, and you don't get the high stability that one had assumed one would get as a result of a long arc of education and then apprenticeship. Okay, so it just as a visual representation of what we're getting coming out of universities, we have qualitatively oriented students who are great at hermeneutics and interpretation, and the thinking about relationships, psychological subtleties, linking social forces and the inner life together, complicated and difficult and ambiguous practices of information and knowledge creation. And they end up in nonprofits, in social organizations or NGOs, in the arts workplace. And that puts them directly, do not pass go directly to being in the bottom 50% of the wage ladder and be precarious, and in some cases, for the first few years, be unpaid and carried by your friends and family. Okay, and then we have, on top of that, we have the quants, the people that are good at this other thing, at quantitative analytics of various kinds. And they at least have a chance of getting into the corporate or the technology workplace, and they have at least a chance of getting into the top 10% or the top 1%, which is really the area in the American economy that has the characteristics of what we used to associate with the broad middle class. All right, so I think this stratification is a kind of a social crisis. It's certainly a generational crisis for millennials, and it also poses the problem of what the heck we are doing in the humanities, one that is often thrust upon us by a skeptical media, by doubting politicians, and in many cases by our own colleagues, families, and friends. All right, so there's a lot of text here, but I'm going to go, we don't have to read all of it. It just is to pose the question of why this is the case. Why do we have what quants up here and quals down here? Why this stratification? Does it only have to do with sort of the pragmatics of the way that businesses work, or is there something deeper and more cultural that we also need to think about? There are interesting sort of culture-based explanations, like most people think of artists as sort of working class, or they see them as following a vocation and being paid in basically in pride and in independence and not really needing a wage. People often thought of teaching as that kind of a profession as well. There are also is a kind of a status issue, even though artists have to be their own managers, and in fact, entrepreneurial in hustling for jobs and hustling for connections. Because of the absence of a corporate structure, they're often thought to actually not have, to be entrepreneurial, to instead be on the sort of the receiving end of largesse coming from society. And then there's all sorts of stereotypes about, art is what children do, art is what retired people do, art is a pastime, it's a leisure activity. It's a fun thing that has really nothing to do with actual work. So here's a sort of a summary of some of these trends that I'll just put in front of you as really as something to have in the back of your mind as we go on to think more about where the humanities can connect up with an innovation discourse that people take seriously. And so far what we're seeing is that the humanities has an innovation discourse that nobody thinks is serious and that they also don't see as particularly innovative. One general reason is something that Bob talked about, this term neoliberal, that the American macro culture we say informally, in our genes, to be market-oriented, to be skeptical about intellectual things that don't seem to pay in a direct way, skeptical of things that are not sufficiently commercial. And there's also this kind of Puritan base in which, it really goes back to Plato, but it's also a kind of a strain in American Protestantism, in which artists who are not turning their hand directly to the reproduction of the society through family and through work are idle in a deep sense and must suffer, or can be allowed to suffer. And then there's something else that I talked a lot about in that book, which I think is an ongoing issue, and that is that the American right has been fighting basically 100 years war around culture, and it has won. It's fundamentally victorious in terms of the political world framings of issues. And one that George Lakoff talks about has to do with the strong versus the nurturing father, and the strong father is, is sort of the default mode, and the nurturing father is the one that comes in when you don't need to circle the wagon, feed the kids, make sure the country is strong, get the economy back on its feet, et cetera. It's basically 100% of the general challenges that we see as a society in front of us have the strong father as the lead figure and the nurturing father as recessive and optional, and in the universities, with the children, but not out in front, taking care of business. And then there's also this question of democracy. We see ourselves as the leading, really, democratic nation and a beacon of inspiration around the concept of democracy in the world. My feeling, having lived in and studied American culture for longer than I care to contemplate, is that we actually, as a society, don't believe in democracy as efficient or as ethical. That is, that democracy allows unethical behavior to dominate, the good drives out the bad, and that we need a kind of constitutionally moral values to control it. And that also, if you look at our business system, or if you look at our universities, we don't believe that self-organized democratic practice is effective in managing systems, and we move it to auditoriums and to committees rather than allowing it any kind of direct power over budgeting or over capital projects, or even finally over the approval of the overall curriculum. So I think that these are all things that militate against the arts and humanities having a central and a prominent place, and they're kind of cultural biases that we're familiar with. But the question that I also bring to this is, can we really stop and say, that the situation is hopeless in getting arts and humanities into a central or a leadership role, and that we just have to be content with our niche? And the answer to this is no, we can't stop here, partly because that outcome is unacceptable, at least to me. That is the secondary recessive position, but also because I don't think that this is really the whole story. And I would use science as an example, actually. They have interestingly, all the same problems. They don't really work either. They are, if you do polling, they are at least as politically left as humanities folks. The academic discipline that was the most completely opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 were engineers, not English professors. They're really hard. They're less popular than we are. In reality, they don't make money the way that the public often thinks. They actually lose money also. But it doesn't really hurt them in the same way. They're struggling now on the national level for various reasons. But they're definitely not in a secondary position in terms of the academic hierarchy, or in terms of what expertise is that the society looks to solve its basic problems. So I think there's a deeper issue that we have to think about, and here's where we get a bit into economic issues, and there's only going to be 2 charts like this. I want to reassure you in the beginning. And that is that we had a deal, and the deal is off. And the deal is shown by this chart called the Mischel wedge, after the economist that developed it. And what it shows you is that for the 30 years that were also great years for the public university, from 45 to 75, more or less, if you went to school, invested in your education, increased your productivity, you would also increase your wage. So down here, as your productivity goes up individually and as the society's overall productivity goes up, compensation tracks with it, and that basically just stopped. There are complicated political and other reasons for this, but it can be seen on a simplified statistical level is that although we continue to invest as a population, we continue to go to school, we continue to go to college, we continue to increase our productivity and our creativity and our creative capabilities and our talents of every kind, we continue to increase our contribution to society, we do not continue to increase our wages. There is one group for which this is not true, this loss of the upward ramp, and that is the top 10%. They, in fact, have continued. So the game now in going to college is not to go to college so you can join the middle class, but go to college so you can escape the middle class, get into the upper middle class or into the 1%, because that is the only place where over a period of decades your productivity will be fairly rewarded with proportional compensation gains. Okay, so I mean crude about what college is about, but just in terms of the economic argument for college, the argument became very fragile in the mid-70s, and it's basically never recovered. Okay, so this is part of the problem. There's a destroyed productivity bargain where if you went to college, you would be rewarded for it, all sorts of spiritual and intellectual ways, but also materially. And then there's the second issue, which is that it's policy-driven. It's globalization, but I would add a sentence to that word, which is, or a half sentence, globalization as interpreted by American policymakers. Because what you see here is that all these other wealthy countries, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, I had Singapore there in one version of it, Japan, they decreased inequality. This is showing you is the percent of national wealth that is owned by the top 1%. And what happened is after World War II, or after the Depression, societies became much more equal. That is, the very top had a much smaller percentage of total wealth. So the 1% only had 6% in Japan, say in 1945. And then what you also see is that the majority of these wealthy societies stayed relatively egalitarian. That is, they did not respond to whatever you want to call it, post-Fordist capitalism or the rise of neoliberal capitalism after the mid-1970s by drastically increasing the inequality of their societies. Only 2 countries did that. And one of them is the United Kingdom, turquoise, and the other, the big champion in the lime green, is the United States. Okay, so there's something specifically about what the French call Anglo-Saxon business culture, political culture, and then something exceptionally unusual about the United States that has produced the situation that we are now in which being middle class is a recipe for decline rather than rise, which is what we had expected before. Okay, so we have these issues that we've already looked at, and then we also have, this is really the way that I would bring together this question of why are the millennials unable to get creative industry jobs in the arts, but they can get them in engineering, and this economic issue. And that is that basically post-middle class economics or neoliberal economics, late capitalism, there's lots of phrases for this stage that we've been in basically since the mid-1970s, that hits non-corporate sectors first. That is, that a highly organized corporate part of the economy has been able to protect itself from what has been happening in the larger economy. And so it's almost an arbitrary distinction is what I'm saying, that STEM graduates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics have an easier time getting into those areas than do arts and humanities graduates. And the reason for that is that it's pretty simple. There are many, but the simplest one is just they have skills that go directly to bottom line issues, and arts and humanities skills tend to be more indirect and more mediated. Okay, so I do think that we now have sort of 3 factors, and this is the third, the economic one. And then the fourth, and this is the one that I'm going to talk about in the time that I have remaining, is I'm going to call the culture of the knowledge economy, which I think is a biased and narrow culture that I personally associate with Silicon Valley, but which takes many forms. And I summarize this doctrine as technogenesis. I don't know where I got this word exactly, but in other words, where genesis in the sense of an originary power to create new life in the economy, new economic life, comes almost exclusively from technology, not from capital in the traditional sense, really. It has to be capital married to labor, and not from to technology, and not from labor. So the traditional elements of say capitalism as analyzed by Marx and many other people are in this scheme more or less set aside in favor of technology itself as the primary driver. And here, if you can see actually to the bottom of the slide, you can see the pretty obvious implication for us, which is that science wins, and it's, people who don't do science in this economy and in this world simply can't. You drop out of, you're not in science fields because you basically flunked OChem and you're forced to go into English or art history. And the reason for this is, in this scheme is that, well, because science makes money, and also science is creative in the sense that it makes something real and something valuable. What the arts make in this concept is secondary. It's not even sub-creation, right, in Tolkien's sense. It's sort of below that. Okay, so what we have here, can anyone actually read this? Is those 4 things that I just listed are actually work as kind of a cycle. We have neoliberal materialism, we have weak democracy, we have what one set of authors have called the global auction, in which you have high skills, but it gets you low wages because you're in competition with really high-skilled people in India and in Taiwan and other places that are willing to work for a lot less. And then we have this techno-biased knowledge in the knowledge economy. And we have subordinated arts and humanities, in which all of the activities and the practices that involve, community and relationships and the human, and I'm going to say a bit more about this in a second, that Bob was talking about at the end of his lecture, are subordinated to the other activities in this system. So the point of putting it in this loop is simply to say that they reinforce each other, that the more desperate you get to get into a job that still has a high wage, the more you buy into STEM dominance, the more subordinated art and humanities become, and so on. Okay, so this is kind of a doom loop that I think we have the potential of getting stuck in for a while, but which I'm going to argue is something that we can actually get out of. So far, so good? Any questions on this? Is this clear enough for the second half? Yes? Okay. All right, so here's the the fix, and it basically has 2 parts. And the first is to critique this innovation theory from the point of view of the humanities. And I'm going to give you a crude version of that in a minute. It's going to involve Schumpeter. It's going to involve a guy named Thomas Stewart, and it's going to involve a guy named Clayton Christensen. And then, so that's basically exposing the problems. And the second thing is redefining the deep needs of society beyond technology innovation. This is where the humanities become co-equal partners in imagining what the next economy, a sustainable economy, would actually look like, along with the economists and technologists and so on, and the other people that dominate the conversation right now. So it's, I think of this as kind of a neo-humanism of Massbildung, that is of individual development turned into a large scale and basically egalitarian social practice. And I think that's more or less where we have to go, as I'll say at the end. Okay, on this first question, what we have is essentially an alliance between guys like this, between celebrity artists turned do-gooders. This is Bono of U2, and then Bill Gates in one of, I think, the most admiring expression I've ever seen on his face. Wearing one of his nicer tweed jackets, which doesn't come out very well. And it's, these are just like billionaires, technologists, and rock stars. They're all the same thing, and they're the people that create the world, the way that I was just talking about before. But this guy is named Joseph Schumpeter, interestingly wearing the same jacket that Bill Gates is, only 40 years earlier. And he's the economist that came up with the innovation model that is absolutely dominant in the United States. The term that you've heard, this term, creative destruction, I imagine. And it was actually a breathtaking insight given the inability of neoclassical economics at the time that he's writing, sort of the first and second thirds of the 20th century, to think about invention as a central driver, as capital and labor. And so the basic point that he made was that the drive to offer new products and new methods, this endless creativity, incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one. So it's essentially a blanket justification for damage of every kind that liberals and city planners and so on complain about, but that the vital forces in the society must, if they are to be true to the spirit of capitalism, run roughshod over, right? You cannot, if you're a life-giving capitalist in this innovation model, pause to respect the olive tree people who will always be holding you back. Okay, so Tom Friedman is essentially channeling this concept, and he's referred to at least the phrase, if not the passage, dozens of times. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a whole bunch of text up, and it's really annoying, but it's essentially to put all of Joseph Schumpeter's thought on one slide, which is something that I love to do in my teaching in general. And there's this older model of capitalism that's investment and jobs as part of it, prosperity and concentrated wealth, leading to more capital, has something that's missing that Schumpeter puts in it, which is technology. And then there are a whole bunch of what I consider to be just myopic cultural biases, prejudices, bigotries that get imported into Schumpeter's understanding of how capitalism works. They have deep cultural roots. They are cultural ideas. They're not really economic ones, but they have gotten fused with the economic ideas in the transmission of the concept. So one of these is that the technological innovation comes from the individual entrepreneur and not from the owners or labor or government or the skill of workers or from collaboration. So Schumpeter disliked corporations as much as he liked laborers, workers. He thought that actually socialism was going to be ushered in by Bayer Corporation because they just had armies of bureaucrats that were destroying the vital forces. He was not a fan of corporate capitalism in that sense. But the thing that I would point to here, it's clearer in the next one, or next couple of ones, is that collaboration is also something that can hold, it absolutely does hold back the individual entrepreneur, so that social relations in which all of us are embedded are anti-innovation. That means that, this is a problem for universities, which is, shows up here. Governance, in the sense of self-governance or self-rule, the collaboration of people sitting down and deciding what their plan is anti-entrepreneurial, because the entrepreneur is always sort of an outsider and ahead of the people who are trying to make it nice for everybody. So the people who are trying to make it nice for everybody have to be seen by economists and by entrepreneurs as problems and as obstacles. We're getting through to, I think, a fairly simple explanation for why Silicon Valley moguls are so often libertarians. They're kind of liberal around social issues like gay marriage. They're adamantly opposed to, say, paying taxes that support the public community colleges and state colleges right down the road from their world-striding businesses, because they basically don't believe that all of the people that come out of mass higher education really add value. The person that made Apple value was Steve Jobs and maybe Johnny Ive, his lead designer, and a few other people. It's not all the brilliant engineers that came out of Danza College and San Jose State and Berkeley, et cetera, that wrote the code and did all that stuff. It's really Jobs. It's really Bill Gates, and it's really Bono, even though people who follow music think that Bono is an absolute atrocity on the skill level. But he's nonetheless Mark Anderson is another example, the guy that basically gifted what became Netscape to Jim Clark and became the biggest initial public offering in history in 95. It's not just that Mosaic, the initial browser, was written on a government grant in Urbana, Illinois. It's that Anderson was the salesman, not the engineer. So the guy that's a wealthy investor married to another member of Silicon Valley royalty, the point, he is not actually the creator, even though he gets to count Schumpeter's model as the entrepreneur that basically made the whole thing happen. Okay, so innovation's risk justifies unequal wealth. So America has the most unequal distribution of wealth because it's the most innovative society. You can't have one without the other in this model. So when you go back to that chart and you see the US, the percentage of national wealth owned by the 1% going off the chart, the appropriate response in this model is, yay America and yay capitalism, because that's the way it ought to be. And then the last one that's also very important for operating universities and creating teachers is that real innovation basically involves replacing labor with technology, replacing it. So MOOCs that were mentioned earlier, massive open online courses, are an example of Silicon Valley pumping tens of millions of dollars into a terrible idea, if you know anything about teaching, that in other words, you can automate it and broadcast it and eliminate the personal connection between the teacher and the student, because everything in their programming is about doing exactly that, about eliminating the human relationship with technology. This is the Industrial Revolution model that we've had since the 18th century, and many people think it's basically run its course. So essentially where this ends up with, if you're coming out of the humanities, you have our experiences both with teaching and with research and with literature and art, et cetera, and with universities, and you look at this, what you see is that it's basically left everything out that's important about our understanding of creativity, that it also has cast them as drags, as drains on capitalism. In other words, it's not just that the English department doesn't make a ton of money, they almost always run in the black. It's not that, it's the opportunity cost problem. If you gave the $150,000 you spend on staff salaries in English to engineering, they would make 10x on the investment, whereas all English is going to do is produce some students. Right? So, I mean, the whole thing becomes very logical if you look at it from their perspective, and also, from my point of view, pretty pernicious. Okay, so humanities as an obstacle and the practices that are attached, that the humanities studies that we exist to study and develop are also, sort of cast out in this way. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this man. He's pretty interesting, actually. He formulated knowledge management in the 90s when corporate America was starting to worry that everybody was reading Tom Peters and In Search of Excellence and thinking that the empowered employee was the secret to profits, not management and not organization and not finance and not these other things. So what Stewart did in this book that came out in '97 called Intellectual Capital, when he had come from Booz Allen to Fortune, he was an editor there, and then edited Harvard Business Review, is he came up with this handy way of deciding what to do with your employees in a corporation. And essentially what you see is that there are half of, some people are easy to replace and some people are difficult to replace, right? And those come in two categories. There are the easy to replace people who don't add much value, and you basically you use technology to get rid of them. You just use their activities. An annoying version of this is automated phone answering systems, where you don't get an operator, you get a whole bunch of choices and then a mechanical voice. Then there are other options here that I won't go through, but you can basically see what the logic is. The easy to replace high value added people is more complicated. You don't really know what to do, but usually you send them to really highly skilled people in India. That's outsourcing has been the shorthand version of that. There's only one group that you really care about. And these are people who are difficult to replace and they add a lot of value. These are essentially STEM people. They write stuff that you can see has a direct impact on your returns, on your revenues. These other people, it's not so clear. These people, the low value added people, they don't add anything that you really care about. So you want to basically get rid of them, even if they're hard to replace. And these people, again, you're not really so sure about. What universities try to do is with ever increasing desperation, is give students high-end skills that make them difficult to replace. So when they graduate from our universities, they can go into institutions that will value them because they have good skills and they have skills that are hard to replace. The problem is that there's really only a subset of these people for whom that will ever be true in this knowledge management model. So essentially what Stewart did with this was to say, take innovation and sort the sheep from the goats in your own company to be profitable. That is, radically shrink your creative workforce because they cost a lot of money. Keep a piece of your not so creative workforce that you have to keep because you can't find anybody else that can do it as well as you can. And then everybody else, fire them as fast as you can. Outsource them, fire them and then rehire them as contractors. You know, there's a lot of things that you can do. But anyway, this gets kind of established by the mid-90s, and it's a really powerful weapon against the creatives who thought they were the new gold-collar workers. You know, the Generation Ys who were really going to inherit the earth in some deep way and who turned out not to have. And then this very interesting man, Clayton Christensen, who is really the dean of innovation studies in the management world in the United States, who's extremely good. I mean, I think his work is really quite good, and who also was in Korea at one time earlier in his life. The point of this slide is that not only that he was a missionary, but that he's very tall. And he had a breakthrough in the 90s with a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which then became The Innovator's Solution. And I mean, this is a kind of an amazing thing to say about innovation, which we think is all about genius and about the higher and better thing. The most important innovation is disruptive innovation, which doesn't attempt to bring better products to established customers in existing markets. It doesn't attempt to bring better products. Rather, disruptive innovations disrupt and redefine the trajectory by introducing products and services that are not as good as currently available products. But disruptive technologies offer other benefits. Typically, they are simpler, more convenient, and less expensive products that appeal to new or less demanding customers. Okay, so this is actually an amazing thing that he figured out. I mean, it's kind of under the nose of everybody. And that is that in order to make money in the sort of post-Fordist economy in the United States, you had to not be Xerox, you had to be Canon. You had to not be US Steel, you had to be doing some kind of specialty steel. You had to not be the University of California at Berkeley, you had to be something like BYU Idaho. Okay, so what he's saying is the future of any sector is controlled by the people who are moving down market, not by the smarty pants who are moving up market, and not by the companies that are desperately scrambling to keep an ever higher niche in the business world. It's by the people who go out there and look at all the folks that are working at Walmart and think, you know, they don't have the academic background to do well at, say, you know, Cal State Fullerton. They don't have the money actually even to go to a state school, but they do have enough skill and enough background to do some kind of hybrid online with some storefront advising that I'm going to set up and charge them $500 for. So you have University of Phoenix that's been doing this for a long time. You have a lot of providers that are doing this, some really badly, some very well. And Christensen is the guy in this book, The Innovative University, that codified it within the framework of this larger understanding that he's had for a long time of where American capitalism has to go. Okay, so the implication of all this stuff is the following. Here's, I think, where we end up with this. The critique, and here, you know, this is the critique. The innovation model that dominates now, that dominates in business schools, that dominates American common sense, the media, academic managers, pretty much everybody in the society, is that thinking about broad human and cultural factors, as we do in the humanities, restrains, if not actually crushes, innovation. It's simply reminding you about stuff you have to have in there. You have to have some diversity. You have to have some sexuality studies. But you don't really want to spend any more money on it than you have to, because that's not where you're going to be helping your bottom line. And so this is the technogenesis issue also, where what does really help your bottom line is almost entirely technological. And then secondly, that this innovation model blocks every university, every college in the United States' effort to enable broad upskilling for the great majority. And this is Thomas Stewart's contribution. That is, you can spend a lot of money making everybody smart and able, but I can promise you the corporations out there are only going to hire 10% of them at a good wage. And they're going to have to be IP lawyers or something else. They're not going to be just really good BAs with a lot of skills. And this is this new global auction era that we're in. And that's Stewart. And then Clay Christensen, without wanting to do this, because I don't believe that this is compatible with his personal ethical framework, nonetheless has designed an understanding of the innovative form of modern capitalism, which sustains a 90-10 polarization, where you basically have a small number, say 10%, working at companies that can move up market, charge global prices, and then 90% that are scrambling to get what will soon count as a good job in one of those moving down market sort of companies, or will not even be in a down market company at all. In other words, where you can imagine a world in which 10 or 15 years being a professor at DeVry or at the University of Phoenix will be a relatively stable and good job compared to the adjuncting that so many people would be doing at, say, publicly badly funded community colleges. All right, so I think where this ends up is that this is stuff that has worked for the United States and for the West for a while, a couple hundred years, worked really well for the United States for 30 or 40 years. It's not working anymore. It's producing both economic flattening out in a global context, and it's producing social dysfunctions on a level that are basically no longer tolerable. Okay, so having spent all of my time on the critique, I'm going to buzz through a couple of things about what I think will actually, we can put in its place. The point we are in the lecture now is, okay, well, so you're so smart and you think that, innovation capitalism, a la the brightest minds that have thought about it, Schumpeter, Christensen, et cetera, isn't any good. What would be better? Okay, so just working within the humanities, I mean, there are other discourses that we could draw on. I'm going to propose some things. The first has to do with some work that I've done that I won't dwell on, and the first is to say that actually we not only make money, so that whole stereotype is just bogus and should be contested at every turn, but we actually give money to the STEM disciplines. That where there is it's cheaper to teach our students. We earn more money on teaching than we actually get in our humanities budgets by and large. And we then have it transferred over without actually being asked about this in almost all cases by central administration to other departments. And the evidence for this is almost the only slide that I know of where a university administrator actually produced a visual for some budgeting. And what you see here is that if you look at engineering, this is Arizona State in 2010, you see a net a loss of $20 million in our money-making operation, that is engineering and life sciences, natural sciences over here. Nursing, law, all lose money. The big money maker, and this is true in every budget that I've ever seen, is the social sciences. Business makes a lot of money because you don't have labs, you're not really doing that much with equipment, even though the salaries are higher. And you'll see also in the positive column at ASU, the humanities. Because this is, I think, a pretty standard breakdown, and it's an important point to make, but I won't pause on it. Then the second thing has to do with creativity itself. We have innovation as kind of the effect of individual creativity. Innovation is this larger systemic product. But how do you get people, those entrepreneurs, those scientists, those artists, to be creative in the first place? And here I don't think it's possible to avoid going through the traditional understandings of how the university works and what kinds of learning practices happen in them in order to explain where creativity comes from in the first place. This was a traditional mission in the historic university. The founding president of the University of Chicago said in the late 19th century, a career means not learning just skills, but producing people that can develop their own methods of work. I mean, we talked about Dewey, so I won't mention him. My favorite, or read through that, my favorite version of this is the formative president of the University of California, a big Teddy Roosevelt kind of guy, who invented, without wanting to, the academic senate at the University of California by being such an authoritarian tyrant that he forced the faculty to finally respond by organizing. But he says the university proposes to rescue men from slavery and make them free from the bondage of routine. A freeman is a man who can initiate. Each person needs the power to act, to shape, to create. So I mean, he's actually equating routine learning, passive learning, and just having content knowledge, and remember, this is 1900, with bondage. You know, which is quite a strong term in a country like ours that has this massive history of slavery. There's the whole German Bildung precedent, which I will just point to briefly. I don't have time to actually work through this. But I would say that Germany, although it's weird for us to think of, in 1789, when all this thinking about the university is starting to take place in a serious way, sees itself as, if not exactly a frontier nation, at least one that is fragmented and incoherent. It's in the middle of Europe, but it isn't really a country. It doesn't have big cities. It's kind of weirdly poor. It has a really great and effective army, but it kind of is over here in Prussia. It's not really in all these other German states. But the thing that they actually have is a bunch of universities in very coherent towns run by people that have an amazing mission, I mean, a crusade vision of what universities are supposed to do. It's essential, I mean, they see universities as, you know, in sort of the Hegelian Fichtean context, as developing talents in a way that will completely transform society. The ultimate purpose of the university should be the acquisition of the art of using knowledge. Students should cultivate their facility for self-directed learning, enabling them creatively to appropriate and transform knowledge in infinite ways. And then, you know, Fichte, this is something that always, you know, it seems so bitterly ironic to me now. One of the conditions for being a student is being freed from any kind of concern regarding your livelihood. That is, essentially, college has to be free to you, because the thought of not only dividing your time and literally working 1 or 2 work days a week to support yourself, which half of my students do at UC, but having your attention divided and normalized by the work world would destroy your ability to become creative. And here's Schleiermacher's vision, is really to live on the streets like the ancients, to fill them with music and singing like people from the Mediterranean, to feast like the rich as long as money lasts, and then to despise all comforts of life like the ancient cynics, completely to neglect one's clothing or to dress up fashionably. That is academic freedom. I like the emphasis on the clothes as essential to it. It's not clothes, it's total choice, right? It's, in other words, it's creativity as depending radically upon the power of absolute freedom to choose this idea over that idea, etc. And I guess, I mean, the way that I would really summarize this is to say that in this sequence that we have now in the United States of using your reason, having it shaped in college, and then having that support the economy, which then supports society, what the university, to all of its best imaginers, has always proposed is actually linking the university directly to the unfolding of the destiny of mankind. That is, that we are central to a social purpose that is simultaneously a spiritual and existential one, that there's no difference between social development and intellectual development as it is manifested there. All right, just a couple of more things here. The Renaissance in the human sciences after World War II, and I use the word Renaissance advisedly, takes all of these novel and interesting and powerful forms that are frightening to many and exhilarating to many others. They connect the university to social movements and to social forces in a way that had not been seen in the United States before. They liberated people from feeling the narrowness of the college, post-college option that they had been sent to college having foremost in mind. They made the society in hostility as well as in supportiveness see the university as directly relevant to society. They made the right wing see the university for the first time as something that had to be contained in a systematic way. And Lewis Powell and many others got involved in building really magnificent institutional networks in order to do that. And it brought a whole new contingent of American society into the university, as you know, fulfilling or promising at least to fulfill the promise of sort of universal higher education really for the first time. So this is a chart from the book that we can essentially ignore except for the pink column on the far end where the university is reinforcing democracy, a kind of a wage or a labor understanding of inventiveness, and the value, that multiracialism, seeing the civil rights movement not as all right, you're right, we were wrong, we have to give you some stuff, but as seeing it as emancipatory for everybody that was part of the society that was being opened up through that movement. There are other examples of this, and I would bring back Christensen this time actually in a positive mode, because although I have concerns about some of the way that he advises people to set up schools on the model of BYU Idaho, and that's something we might want to talk about a little bit in question. What he does understand, and it's something that he has very much in common with Martha Nussbaum, is the transformative personal effects of college and the university as a unique institution and absolutely unique institution in society. So these are, I think, this would be my list, an initial list of the way that the humanities can be used to essentially help redefine the deep needs of society beyond this narrow understanding of sort of late capitalist innovation that we've been working with so far, that we do subsidies, we have a unique relationship to all of the factors and the complexity of the interaction of the factors that form the self, that we are in the process of building something I haven't talked about at all, which is an actual research infrastructure, and that, and this is really the final thing, that the humanities has practices and understanding that are the elements of an innovation counter theory, something that I hope that we can develop in the next 10 or 20 years. What all this is trying to show is that we have a kind of a Schumpeterian, this is the left column, innovation theory that is no longer functioning effectively in the way that it had before. We have a series of new needs for kind of a global, maybe it's post-capitalism, maybe it's something else, American economy that is just beginning to emerge and that needs to emerge in a kind of an unrestricted way intellectually. And then we have, interestingly, as a result of the 50-year Renaissance that I was talking about, a whole series of insights and understandings about nonlinear innovation that can be connected point by point by point to insights that we and our colleagues around the world in fields that we represent have been developing over these past decades. The rose band ends up with craft agency, which is one that we talked about before with for human formation, individual formation. And I would argue that we have something to say really about each of these things if we had the time and the energy to go through all of them, and the collaborative structure that would allow all of us to sort of work on this project together. So The last thing I want to say is a little bit negative, which is that I don't think that we're quite ready for this. We are still seeing ourselves as, if not actually victimized by this discourse, as marginal to it, as not really having the skills that we need to move into it. We're stuck, I think, too frequently in defensive mode. But for me, that moment of defense is basically is just an opportunity. So this, absolutely the last slide, is I think where we can go from here. The first is the critique, showing the problems that with Schumpeterian innovation as being anti-democratic, wasting of the talents, as Bob talked about, of most of the population, certainly most of the college population, and endangering this middle-class form of society, which has been relatively stable and relatively just. And then secondly, re-articulating the deep needs of society, using the existing pieces that we've already developed over the last 50 years to develop a democratic, an egalitarian, an inclusive, a subjectively rich counter model of innovation based on the kinds of things that all of us in this room are already doing. Thanks for your patience. That was